Let us now study the constituents of the blood. What does the blood contain? We have about 5 liters of blood in our body, and when we cut ourselves, the blood looks like a red fluid, but there is more than just that to it. It contains red blood cells, which is what actually makes the blood red, and they have no nucleus. Now let's explain red blood cells and their functions in the circulatory system. In the blood capillaries around the lungs, the red blood cells contain hemoglobin, which is what oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules actually stick to when they are transported in the blood. When hemoglobin absorbs oxygen, it forms oxyhemoglobin. And then when blood reaches the body tissues, the reverse of this reaction happens, where oxyhemoglobin gives back oxygen. This is the oxygen that is released to the body cells so that they can use them to make energy. And when oxyhemoglobin is broken down to oxygen and back to the protein hemoglobin, hemoglobin will become, in its initial state, the way it was before it actually took oxygen from the lungs. This makes the hemoglobin proteins free to attach to oxygen again. Here we see oxygen molecules in white attaching to hemoglobin. After we have explained the function of red blood cells, let's talk about a different constituent of the blood, which is the platelets. Usually when we cut our hands, something called a blood clot happens to stop the bleeding, where we find the blood beginning to solidify. Platelets are small fragments of cells. They are not whole cells. They are made in the bone marrow like other blood cells, but they have no nucleus. Platelets come to the site of injury when we have a cut in our hand. They make threads made out of proteins to close the wound and prevent bleeding. Let's explain now the function of white blood cells. White blood cells are part of the blood, so of course they're part of the circulatory system, but they are also related to the immune system. They are much larger than red blood cells. They have a nucleus and they are far less than red blood cells. We have around 200 red blood cells to every 1 white blood cell, and they are made in the bone marrow. Now let's remember, red blood cells do not have a nucleus, but white blood cells do. The number of white blood cells is very low in comparison to the number of red blood cells, 1 white blood cell to every 200 red blood cells. They are made in the bone marrow, and there are 2 types of white blood cells actually, called lymphocytes and phagocytes. White blood cells form part of the body's defense system against microorganisms, which are like viruses and bacteria. And thus we have talked in general about the blood and the constituents of the blood, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets.